All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at our afternoon seminar. My name is Cinnamon Moffett, and I'm the Associate Director for Marine Research Support here at Hatfield. For those folks that are here in the room, thank you for making the swim this way. I appreciate it. It's going to rain on us a little bit more, but good place to spend the afternoon is with us, so I appreciate it. For folks online, thank you for joining us in that format as well. We do have your mics, cameras, and screen shares turned off for this event, but please put any questions you might have, technical challenges or questions for our presenter in the chat box, and we have a volunteer in the room, Roseanne, who will read those questions out or get them addressed. So thank you very much for being here and participating in our conversations that way. For folks in the room, just a quick reminder, if you didn't already, make sure you sign in on the sign-in sheet outside. That's how we justify buying cookies and coffee. So I just need a head count. So please do that. That's great. The other thing for you all, because this is a hybrid event, if you have a question for me or for our speaker today, please just raise your hand and we'll bring you a mic. And that way folks online can participate in our conversation as well. But again, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to make a couple of quick announcements for folks, and then I'll hand it off to our speaker. So next week we have a lunch and learn for those folks here at Hatfield. Lunch and learns are just an opportunity to engage in a conversation that we might not normally talk about during our research day. And so this particular one is hosted by the Green Team and is talking about what's the deal with compostable foodware and what can we actually do with it. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that before the holidays, join us on November 19th. In the library seminar room at noon. And there's a flyer that's out on that sign-up sheet, and I'll put it back out there when we're done. So just letting you know about that. I also wanted to promote next week's seminar. So on November, not the 14th, that's today. So what's next week, the 21st. Thank you, everyone. Scott Low Ranger is an acoustician from Kongsberg Discovery, and he will be here at Hatfield to talk about applications of broadband acoustic backscatter. So if that's of interest to you or you want to learn a little bit more, come and join us next Thursday at 3:30 in this room. For today, though, kind of doesn't need any introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Today's speaker is Bill Chadwick. Bill Chadwick is a research professor with Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center here in Newport and is part of NOAA's PMEL Earth, Ocean, and Interactions program. Bill majored in geology at Colorado College, where he received his bachelor's, after which he worked at Mount St. Helens, which I believe recently had exploded during your college time. So it must have been a really exciting time to work at Mount St. Helens. He then continued to get his PhD in geology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. After a short postdoc with USGS, he joined us here at Oregon State, where he has been ever since. Lucky us. His current research interests include investigating how magma is supplied to and stored in active volcanoes, what happens during submarine eruptions, and how underwater eruptions affect the chemistry and ecosystems of hydrothermal vents. His research uses all sorts of great technology as autonomous underwater vehicles and remotely operated vehicles to monitor the seafloor, make observations, and we'll see some of that today. So I'm really excited to pass this along to Dr. Bill Chadwick, and you can go ahead and make your life go by. Wonderful. Welcome.
Thank you, Cinnamon. Thanks everybody for coming and everybody online. Oh, I can't see. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Axial Seamount today, a place I've been working on for a long time while being here at Hatfield. First, some acknowledgements. The work I'm going to talk about, I've done for a long time with my colleague Scott Nooner and also Jeff Beeson, who's here at Hatfield. I've been working with colleagues at MBARI, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, Dave Kress, Dave Clegg, Jenny Padwan, colleagues at University of Washington, William Wilcock, and Mao Chuan Zhang. I'm going to be showing some of their seismic data from Axial, but they're the ones that are working on it. Then there's a whole team of people at UW that operate the Ocean Observatories Initiative Regional Cabled Array. It's a cabled observatory that goes all the way out to Axial Seamount, and that's a huge endeavor with lots of people involved. But I take advantage of the data that comes from that cable, so I'm grateful to them. Andy Lau and Brian Kahn. Andy's now retired. Brian's still here at Hatfield. They've helped me a lot with data processing software and computer guru-ness, so I appreciate them. And also, this work's been funded by the National Science Foundation for many years, so I want to acknowledge them. All right, so here's an outline of my talk. Just talk a little bit about where the heck is axial seamount, a little bit about volcano monitoring and forecasting in general. Then talk about the last eruption out at axial seamount, what happens out there when there's an eruption. And then mostly I'll be focusing on what has happened since then and our efforts to forecast what's going to happen next. Okay, so jumping in, here's our the Northeast Pacific. We're here in Newport. Let me see, get a little pointer here. Yep. So axial seamount is out here on the Juan de Fuca Ridge. So that's about 300 miles west of Astoria, more or less. The Juan de Fuca Ridge is a spreading center, so it's where two tectonic plates are moving apart. And that's why there's volcanism out here on the plate. So we got the Pacific plate out here, Juan de Fuca plate in between. We're on the North American plate. This is the Cascadia subduction zone. So these plates are moving apart. These plates are moving towards each other. These plates are moving side by side. So we have a little of everything in our tectonic neighborhood. If we look at a cross section through there, here's the subduction zone, one plate going under the other. That's makes magma. It melts part of the mantle. When this plate goes down, that feeds the Cascade volcanoes. We're here on the coast, offshore is axial, where these two plates are moving apart. And that causes melting in the mantle that feeds volcanism along the plate boundary. So that's kind of the reason why axial is where it is. But why be interested in that beyond that? For one thing, it's the most active volcano in the Northwest. It's much more active than the volcanoes on land. And for a volcanologist, you learn the most about how volcanoes work by studying them when they're active. So that's a big draw. It's very active, so it's a great place to learn about what happens during eruptions and between eruptions. As I mentioned, axial's on this extraordinary cabled observatory that's goes from shore out to axial. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So it's a huge infrastructure that's out there that enables some extraordinary science. It's also has a relatively simple structure for a volcano because it's on these plates that are spreading apart. So the crust is very thin. There's not a lot of complicating factors that exist at some volcanoes on land. So it's kind of an ideal place to study how magma is supplied and stored, how eruptions are triggered, and that kind of thing that can be applied to other volcanoes worldwide. And also, most of Earth's volcanism occurs in the oceans on mid-ocean ridges. And we know relatively little about how they work. So it's kind of a big deal on a planet-wide basis. Lots to learn. Okay, so a little bit about volcano monitoring and forecasting. So here's a cartoon of various ways that volcanoes can be monitored on land. I'm going to talk particularly about ground deformation. So that's using various kinds of surveying techniques to see how the ground is moving at volcanoes, because that tells you something about what's happening underground where you can't see. And I'll also talk a little bit about seismicity through the work of my colleagues at University of Washington and how these two relate to each other at Axial. So here's a cartoon of Axial. It's at a depth of 1,500 meters. So at volcanoes like Axial, can be the cycle of inflation and deflation. So during inflation, between eruptions, magma is supplied from depth. It gets stored in some sort of reservoir. Probably doesn't look like this. But in any case, as magma is supplied, it builds up pressure. It pushes the seafloor, the surface of the volcano up, and you can measure that uplift, which is basically a change in depth. So, so this is between eruptions. This happens relatively gradually over many years. And then during an eruption, the opposite happens. Magma finds its way to the surface. It drains some of the volume that has accumulated, and then the seafloor goes back down relatively rapidly. So this deflation happens quickly, the inflation happens slowly. So the volcanoes that do this are basaltic volcanoes. So that's the kind that Axial is. Basalt is a composition of lava that, like the volcanoes in Hawaii, are basaltic volcanoes. So the lava is very fluid. They tend to not have explosive eruptions. They tend to spew out lava flows. So Krafla and Kilauea, these are both that kind of volcano. And these are records of inflation and deflation measured at these volcanoes on land in Iceland and Hawaii. So here we're measuring the elevation of the ground going up and then dropping back down. These arrows are all when intrusions happen. So magma's leaving the reservoir and the ground's going back down and then up in between. And you can see that this sometimes, rarely really, is a pretty repetitive process. And you could see that if you had seen a few of these, you could try to anticipate when the next one might occur. So that's kind of the basis of what I'm trying to do at Axial. This is the same sort of thing, but with tilt data instead of uplift data, but same idea. So on land, you measure these kinds of ground motions with GPS. That's the most common these days. There's other various kinds of surveying, like leveling, installing tilt meters, even satellite radar measurements can give that kind of data. But of course, none of those work underwater. So we've had to come up with some creative ways to try to do the same thing. And what we've done is used pressure sensors that are super precise, and they sit on the bottom. And so if there's inflation and the seafloor rises, then there's a little bit less depth of the overlying ocean, and the pressure goes down. And in the same way, if there's deflation, seafloor goes down, then there's a little bit more pressure. And these instruments are so precise that they can measure about a centimeter of depth change. So they're perfectly suited for what we're trying to do. So there's these things we call bottom pressure recorders, or BPRs. They measure pressure continuously. So, and in the early days, we'd put them out for a year or two or three, and then collect them, get the data, maybe throw them back in. Nowadays, there's a bunch of these connected to this cabled observatory, so we actually have data in real time. But in any case, we take the pressure data, convert it to depth. We can remove the tidal signal, and then look at what's left. But these continuously recording instruments have a long-term drift, so you have to have some way to deal with that and try to remove it. And the way we have done that at Axial is to also put out these seafloor benchmarks on the seafloor, and then periodically we visit them with a remotely operated vehicle every 2 years these days. and we put a little pressure sensor that's connected to the vehicle on the benchmark, make a measurement, and then we go to this whole array of, used to be 10, now it's 20 benchmarks. And so we're out there for days making these measurements. And what that gives us is the relative depths of the benchmarks within a centimeter or so. And we use one as a reference site that's outside the area where we think there's uplift happening. And that gives us the relative depths of all the benchmarks that are in the area that's being inflated. So that's how we get around this drift problem. And it enables long-term monitoring, because if you didn't have that, you'd be able to see short-term events, but not a long-term signal that can be small. So here's what this looks like in reality. This is video from 2015, so it's 9 years ago when the ROV Jason went in with 2 bodies instead of 1 that it does these days. So here we're making an ROV dive. We're at one of our benchmarks. We're putting out this pressure sensor, and here we are in the control van up on the ship. There's the pilot who's doing the manipulation, putting these things on the benchmarks. So these are some of the most boring ROV dives around, because we go to these benchmarks over and over again. We're making these measurements over and over again. So not always a lot of thrilling things to look at, but we get great data. Okay, so here's kind of where the story all started. This idea was started by Chris Fox, who's in the room here. He put out one of these bottom pressure recorders that out at Axial, that caught an eruption that happened in 1998. And so on the y-axis is change in seafloor elevation or depth. So you can see this is a huge signal. This is 3.2 meters that the seafloor dropped. You know, that's higher than I can reach. And over about a week, but mostly within a day. So that got all our attention. And then there were a couple of years where there's a data gap in our record where we're figuring out what to do next. Scott Nooner and I started making these measurements with the benchmarks to try to do long-term monitoring. And so with these purple dots are the benchmark depths, and the blue line is the continuous BPR data. So we started making these measurements. We were seeing reinflation, and we could imagine about this time, we could imagine start to think about, okay, about when is it going to get up to the same level it was at in 1998? And it was complicated because of this data gap. We didn't know exactly how this fit with this, but we could kind of eyeball it and estimate it and extrapolate. And you know, we made a forecast around 2006 that, you know, just trying out to see if this would work, that, you know, if this trend continued, that Axial would erupt again before 2014. So we had this big window because there were lots of uncertainty. And then we kept making these measurements, and sure enough, it kind of continued along that trend, and then it erupted in 2011. So, hey, that kind of worked. And so that gave us some confidence, and of course wanted to try it again. So, but in the next few years, we found the inflation rate was quite a bit higher. And this is before the cabled observatory was in, so we only got data every 2 years. So, but in between getting data here and here, our colleagues at Mbari started making a different kind of measurement with repeat bathymetric surveys with an autonomous underwater vehicle. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that allowed us to have a data point here so we could extrapolate through that and then make another forecast. So again, just figuring that the volcano would be about ready to erupt again when it reached about this level. So we, this time a shorter window, in 2015, and hey, we were successful again. So that was even more exciting. So from here on out, this story is not so successful. I'll give you a spoiler. But we'll talk about that later. So here's what the Cable Observatory looks like. This is, again, the Ocean Observatory's regional cable array is what it's called. So from Pacific City, there's one cable that goes all the way out to Axial Seamount. And there's another cable that curves around and comes back onto the margin right offshore Newport, and a bunch of moorings are connected there. Out at Axial, the cable comes out, and then there's a whole bunch of instruments that are plugged into the cable, including 7 seismometers that record earthquakes, and then 4 bottom pressure recorders that look like this. I developed a website with the help of Andy Lau and Brian Kahn for processing that data in real time and displaying it. So there's got this website. Right now, you can click on these links to see data from each of the bottom pressure recorders that kind of look like this. So the red is the pressure data that's had the tides removed, and then the green is temperature sensor. So this is data from the last week. This is data from the last 6 months. So you can kind of keep track and see what Axial's doing out there. This is another website run by my colleague, William Wilcock, and Maochuan Zhang, his student, that has kind of the same kind of real-time updates on the earthquakes out at Axial. And another way of measuring this inflation and deflation signal that I mentioned earlier is doing repeat mapping with autonomous underwater vehicles. They come in various shapes and sizes. This is the Mbari mapping AUV, kind of torpedo shaped. This is the Sentry AUV that's operated by Woods Hole. It's a little bit different shape, but they both do the same thing. So they have multi-beam sonars. And what we do is we run them on the same lines across the summit. Here's the summit caldera of Axial. So we can do these surveys in different years and then look for depth changes between the 2 surveys. So the colors are depth change. So these warm colors are the seafloor getting shallower. And these are cross sections across these radial lines. So here's northwest, southeast, northwest, southeast. You can see that most of the uplift is within the caldera. So our pressure measurements are just at individual spots. So this is another way of seeing that same signal over a larger area with less precision, but the 2 go well together. Okay, so that's what we're doing out there. Now a little bit about the last eruption. Let's see, this is going to play by itself. This is just showing, it plays, yes. This is using seismic data to see where the magma is under the volcano. And it shows that there's kind of a big reservoir that's kind of football shaped or cigar shaped under the summit of the volcano, under the summit caldera. And again, kind of like that cartoon at the beginning, basically magma comes up inside this and then pressure builds up. There's maybe some places where there's more melt than others. Mush is like a crystal, mostly crystals instead of melt. And when the pressure builds up enough, a crack opens and magma is fed up to the surface where it erupts as lava flows. So that's a cartoon of the overall story. So if the water wasn't there, this is what it would look like. We can't see this underwater, unfortunately. This is a picture from Iceland. But what feeds eruptions are things called dikes. That's a geology term to learn for today. So dikes are basically a magma-filled crack. Typically, they're about 1 meter wide, but they can be kilometers long, both vertically and horizontally. And it's basically, that's how magma gets from a magma reservoir to the surface. Because there's usually, that's how the crust breaks open, is along a crack. And the magma comes up under pressure. So it's, shooting up into the air. This is called a ring of fire. And it feeds the lava flows that get fed. So that's pretty much what we think happens underwater, except it's underwater. So we're going to zoom in on Axial Seamount here. This is the Wandafuka Ridge. This is mostly to illustrate that there's 2 rift zones, one to the south and one to the north from the summit caldera here. So this is at a depth of 1,500 meters. The height of the caldera walls here is about 100 meters. The width is about 3 kilometers. So the magma's under here, but when it erupts, it starts in the caldera on the eastern side of the caldera, but then dikes propagate either north or south. That's what we've seen. And the reason for this is, again, the plates are moving apart. So there's tension in that direction. And so these dikes basically fill in the gap that's caused by the plate motion. So that's seafloor spreading. That's how it works. The plates move apart, dikes intrude, make new seafloor. So there have been 3 eruptions in the last 30 years. This one in 1998, the one in 2011, and the most recent one in 2015. Both 1998 and 2011, again, started in the caldera, and a dike intruded way to the south, like 30 to 50 kilometers. We know this from earthquake data in 1998. In 2011, there was a big lava eruption down here 30 kilometers away. In fact, most of the volume of the eruption came out down here. And likewise, in 2015, the dike intruded to the north instead of to the south, probably because these things had just happened. And so there was less tension down there, and it was time to go north. Again, most of the volume of the eruption came out in the farthest lava flows from the caldera. So what seems to happen, this is a cross section along the ridge now. So there's some sort of magma reservoir, and when the pressure gets too big, it intrudes this dike that can go far down the rift zone. Here's previous one to the south. Here's the latest one to the north. And once these dikes are probably only 1 meter or so wide, but they're maybe a couple kilometers high, tens of kilometers long. And they're basically, once they're in place and before everything freezes up, they're a conduit for funneling lots of magma from here out to the farthest part of the dike. And when that happens, we can go out there with a ship or put our AUVs back in the water, resurvey the seafloor and look for depth changes. This is a map of depth change. This is AUV data in the caldera. This is one of the 2015 lava flows that erupted inside the caldera. This thing is only, it's less than 10 meters thick in most places, so very thin, very fluid. Part of the eruption happened very quickly, probably, and then stopped. In contrast, now we're looking way north at the farthest lava flows. These things are tens up to 60 meters here, up to 128 meters here, thickness of new lava. So that sounds like a big number. What is that like? So here's where 120 meters would look like next to the Space Needle. So that's like 2/3 of the height of the Space Needle. So you can imagine this big pile of pillow lava on the seafloor. That kind of brings it home a little bit better. All right, so let's take a look at those. Again, these are from dives. This is video from dives in 2015. We're going out about 4 months after the eruption happened. Going to look at the lava flows in the caldera first. These are the thin ones that came out relatively fast. Nice fresh lava here. These very fast in place fluid flows tend to inflate kind of like an air mattress, and they get a crust on the top, and they can often their interiors drain out before the whole thing solidifies. So you get this kind of upper crust with these big cavities and collapses. Here the ROV's getting a piece. And when the lava drains out, it can make these wild-looking bathtub rings as the lava drains out and is forming these sequential crusts on the things around it. So now we're going further down the rift zone, where this is a new lava flow. Where these flows are really thick, there's so much heat in them, they cool very slowly, and this is all microbial mat that grew on the surface of the lava flow as it was cooling. So it can be very confusing. You go out there looking for a fresh, shiny lava flow, and it's covered with all this mat, and it looks ancient. So that's just a glimpse of what those look like. Here's some data from the 2015 eruption. This is earthquake data from my colleague, William Wilcox. So this is earthquakes per day leading up to the eruption, which is here. Can you see that arrow? Oh, maybe I need to turn my little laser pointer back on. Here we go. So this is data from the cable observatory. So this is basically when the cable came online. So initially there's hundreds of earthquakes per day, then thousands of earthquakes per day, a few thousand, and then the day of the eruption, 9,000 earthquakes in one day. And then it quickly quiets back down. So this is all from the pressure building in this magma reservoir that's getting ready to fail. Here's another view. This time we're looking at earthquakes and the pressure, the BPR pressure data. So in blue is the kind of cumulative number of earthquakes. So we're in February 2015. The eruption's right here. So we're going along at a certain rate, then the rate of earthquakes starts increasing even higher. The day of the earthquake, we have this big, the day of the eruption, we have this big spike. At the same time, the seafloor starts dropping, in this case, 2.5 meters. So this is all happening when all this is happening. Magma is leaving the reservoir. It's making a dike. That's creating all the earthquakes because it's making this crack that's propagating to the surface. As all that magma shoots out of the reservoir, the seafloor starts dropping because you're removing volume, you're sending it down the rift zone. So that's why all these things are happening simultaneously. This plot is just a zoom in right around the eruption. This is April 23rd to 26th. You can see all these things happening more or less at the same time. Let's see. And just another view of the same thing. This is a map of earthquakes. Here's the summit caldera. This is one of the 2015 lava flows. This is a week of earthquakes leading up to the eruption. So this is the kind of the buildup right here. And then on the day of the eruption, of course, lots and lots of earthquakes from the, basically, again, the dike coming up to the surface. There it is, and starting the eruption. Okay. Another view of the seismicity. All these colored dots are earthquakes located. So they're mostly under the two caldera walls, mostly under the eastern wall, some under the western wall. And if you look at a cross section, they're in these outwardly dipping zones under the caldera, the edges of the caldera, these arrows. And that makes sense because when calderas form, they form these faults that you see at the surface where the caldera walls are, but there's also these outwardly dipping faults that accommodate some of that motion. And apparently at Axial, these are the faults that are where the earthquakes are happening. And these things move, but probably without earthquakes. Okay, so that was all about 2015. Let's see what's happened since then. So this is where we left off the story when forecasting was working. So the story has been complicated since then because let's see. The reason why, so the forecasting I've been attempting is really just pattern recognition and extrapolation of patterns, and it's not based on physics or anything. So it only works if the system is being consistent. And in leading up to the 2011 and 2015 eruptions, get the laser pointer back on, that's what was happening. This the rate of inflation was relatively constant, so it worked to extrapolate that rate into the future and to estimate when we were going to get up to this threshold, and that it worked pretty well in both these cases. But since 2015, the rate has not been constant, so that's why it hasn't worked. So it seemed like it was going to work. Here's the 2015 eruption. We had this rapid reinflation, and then for several years it was inflating at about rate of 50 centimeters a year. So in early 2019, I started this process again and made a forecast window. And then soon after, the rate started to decrease. We had this big pause, and afterward, the rate was about half as much. So the eruption, the next window was larger and moved off into the future. Then in late 2020, the average rate had decreased again. So our forecast window kept moving to the right, and pretty soon it's off the page. So by last summer, in the middle of 2023, it just kept slowing and slowing, and by summer of 2023, it had almost stopped. So it was still slightly positive, maybe a centimeter a year, but that's hardly anything. So I stopped trying to forecast because it was impossible to extrapolate a line that's almost flat. Yeah, that wasn't that long ago. That was, about a year ago. But then, so here's summer of 2023. This is that nearly flat portion. It slowly started re-inflating again, and the rate slowly started increasing again. So now in the last few months, it's been at about 25 centimeters, back up to 25 centimeters a year. So time to forecast again. So I'll say that this whole forecasting thing is really just an experiment to see if it works. And I've been doing it in a public way because I feel like it's more honest that way instead of doing it in retrospect. So and also out at Axial Seamount, there's no people that are going to get upset if I'm wrong. There's no problem of having a false alarm or being wrong. You know, if you can't really do that on land because people live near volcanoes and they might have to evacuate and so forth. So it's a lot more complicated. So I've also got this website where there's a blog of our attempts to forecast what's going to happen. So in July of this year, made a new forecast based on this latest data that said Axial could erupt anytime now and probably before the end of 2025. So that's just based on this, again, extrapolating the latest rates. So we're at or near the 2015 threshold. So we got to be close. But then the 2015 eruption or the inflation was higher than in 2011. 2015 it inflated more than in 2011. So that's what these dashed lines are. So I'm giving it enough time to get up to this upper line. So that's what that's based on. Not much. Okay, so I'm going to finish off with just comparing this uplift record with the seismic data and basically showing that they're really interconnected. So here's the 2015 eruption. Here's all the uplift that's happened since then. Here's that latest rejuvenation. And in red is the number of earthquakes per day. So initially after 2015, hardly any. Then about 2018, we started to pick up number of earthquakes. And then there was kind of this long period when the inflation rate was decreasing and the earthquakes were kind of lackluster. But then in this recent uptick, the seismicity has really increased a lot. So some days we're above 1,000 earthquakes per day, which hadn't been seen in a long time. And to comparing that, this is, let's see, this is earthquakes per day. Yeah, so the histogram here is that same data. The red curve is cumulative number of earthquakes. So that's another way of looking at the same thing. You can see it's really jumped up in the last few months. So comparing that with what we saw leading up to the 2015 eruption, the number of earthquakes per day is not as high as in here. So we're kind of in this area, and this rate is also kind of in between these two. This is another way of seeing that with the same data, but with the same range on all these axes. So here's earthquakes per day. This is since 2015. So we're down occasionally over 1,000. This is leading up to 2015. So it was hundreds per day, then many thousands per day leading up to the eruption here. And this is the slope of the cumulative number of earthquakes. You can see it's about the same rate as it's somewhere in between these two parts of the curve. So, you know, maybe we're months away from the next eruption, but who knows? So here's the cumulative uplift. Here's the cumulative number of earthquakes. They're kind of mirror images of each other. You know, the uplift was high at the beginning, low at the end. Earthquakes were low at the beginning, high at the end. So, but if we zoom in here and change the scales, you can see that they're both reacting in a similar way to this latest increase. So here's the increase in inflation. Here's the increase in earthquakes. And the reason why this pattern makes sense is because right after an eruption, there's been this big deflation. And so the crust is all the stress that had built up before that led to the eruption has been released. So everything's relaxed. There's low stress in this crust between the magma and the seafloor. So, but after the eruption, magma is being supplied. So there's lots of uplift and very little seismicity, because the seismicity is in response to stress in the crust. So, but the more you uplift the crust, the more stress builds up. And so with the cumulative uplift, there's higher and higher stress. So you start to get earthquakes. And so for every increment of additional uplift, you get more and more earthquakes. In fact, it's an exponential thing. So here's cumulative uplift with time. Again, at first there's lots of uplift, very few earthquakes. This is cumulative number of earthquakes. But as you go along, we're getting more and more, we've inflated more and more, and for each increment of inflation, we get more and more earthquakes. So it's kind of a cool relationship. Okay, last point. And this is about how the rate of uplift has changed over time. So this is the uplift history. So we can look at that as the rate of uplift instead. So here's, and this is averaging over a 1 year moving window. So right after the 1998 eruption, the uplift rate was high, then it gradually decreased, and then it kind of gradually built up again, leading into these two eruptions, 2011, 2015, and then as we've seen, it went back down again. The uplift of the seafloor is basically a reflection of the magma supply underneath. So that's, you can quantify this as magma supply rate with a model. And, the big picture is there was a big surge in magma supply in between these two eruptions, and that's why they were so close together in time. And also, I'm interested in this pattern because it looks like there's almost a sinusoidal thing, and this latest increase is maybe that means we're going to be up on the upswing again, but we'll see. So I'm interested to see if this pattern is going to continue. All right, so summarizing all of that, since the 2015 eruption, the rate of inflation was initially high, gradually decreased, and approached zero by the summer of 2023. All the forecasting since 2015 has failed miserably because of this changing rate. But since then, just in the last year or so, the inflation rate has increased again, and so has the seismicity rather sharply, has increased rather sharply. So it seems like, plus the fact that we're almost fully reinflated, this seems like we're in the buildup phase to the next eruption. Yes, that's what I just said. So we'll see if it actually erupts in the next year plus. And then these large variations in the inflation rate may be evidence of the longer term kind of decadal cycle of magma supply, maybe. We'll see. All right, last week, the seminar was given by Marley Parker, who's a science communicator, and she went out to sea with me this past summer in June to document what we were doing out at Axial. We were out there making our periodic pressure measurements, and I thought I'd show the video that she made based on that expedition to end with. So here it is. Let's see, I gotta get rid of my laser pointer first. About 3 minutes. It's sort of like being a detective, because you get clues, you're trying to figure out what they mean, and then you collect more evidence and you build a story about what you think is going on. So I just find that really fun. We're out at Axial Seamount, which is about 300 miles west of the coast of Oregon, offshore, and it's an active submarine volcano on the Wanafooka Ridge.
Axial Seamount is one of the most highly studied volcanoes on Earth. Over the last several decades, there has been people doing research in all areas, from hydrothermal vents to the seismicity to what we do, which is measure the deformation of the volcano surface.
It's the most active volcano in the Pacific Northwest, but it might be one you haven't heard of or knew existed because it's about a mile underwater and about 300 miles offshore. But it's had 3 eruptions in the last 30 years.
1998, 2011, 2015. We think it is likely to erupt sometime in the next several years.
What we're doing is studying these eruptions, how it builds up to eruptions, what triggers eruptions. So we're hoping the lessons we learn here can be applied to volcanoes worldwide.
The deformation measurements at the Axial Seamount have been going on since the late 90s. And in science, we have a saying that if you have an ongoing time series data set, you don't allow that time series data set to die. So I've been participating in these cruises for about 8 years now. This is my 4th cruise with the Axial Deformation team. And it's great to be a part of this legacy data set that we've learned so much from.
This is a fantastic project that spans multiple institutions, multiple career stages. We all have slightly different focuses in the research that we bring to the table, from classic volcano geology to the details of high-resolution bathymetry to geophysical techniques to numerical modeling. It really takes all of these areas of expertise combined together to build a picture of what's happening in the subsurface at Axial.
We've got 4 teams out here doing various aspects of the work. We've got the Jason ROV team, and we've got the AUV Sentry team, which are making dives with the AUV and mapping the seafloor. And we got our science team that's doing all the work with the seafloor instruments. And then we have the whole ship's crew that operates the vessel.
We could not do any of this work without the ship, the ROV team, the Sentry team. Everyone involved is required to make this happen.
It's a lot of hard work from a lot of people. It's a lot of brain power that comes together to be able to do this science.
We learn the most about how volcanoes work by catching them in the act. And that's what we hope to do here by putting all these instruments out. We're ready to catch the next eruption at Axial Seamount. Okay, Axial, we're ready. All right, that is the end. Thanks.
Such a great story. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm excited to see next steps. So we have a few minutes for questions. We'll go back and forth, starting online. Roseanne, any questions online? Okay, for folks online, go ahead and put any questions you might have into the chat. How about questions in the room?
Just a quick one. When do you plan on going back out again?
Yeah, so we're on a schedule of every other year making these measurements. So we were just out in June. So our next scheduled expedition is in summer of 2026. If it erupted before then, we would probably try to get out there sooner, but that may or may not be possible. Our colleagues at University of Washington go out every summer because they do maintenance on the cabled observatory. So they have a scheduled cruise next summer. So yeah, it's all these research expeditions get scheduled years in advance. So once things are scheduled, it's hard to move things around, but we'll see.
Other questions in the room?
Thank you. What effect would it have on if people on land, if this erupts, what effect would we feel or would we even know?
Right. We would not know except for looking at the data from the Cable Observatory. Yeah, it's almost a mile deep. So even though there's lava flows coming out on the seafloor, and the ocean is stratified very strongly in density and temperature. And so it's pretty much impossible for any of that heat to get to the surface or, you would, if you went out there and dangled a hydrophone listening for sounds, you'd probably hear the earthquakes and stuff like that. But yeah, there's no effect of the surface. And another question I get asked a lot is, if axial erupts out on the Juan de Fuca Ridge, does it have any effect on the subduction zone close to shore here? And the answer to that is also no, because they're too far apart to have much effect on each other. So there's no danger of that. The subduction zone is also building up to the next earthquake, and we don't know when that is going to be. But yeah, an eruption at axial is not going to put the subduction zone closer to failing. So
is the caldera formed by a huge event like the eruption of Mount St. Helens?
Huge events, yes, but not like Mount St. Helens, meaning a big explosive event. Our colleagues at MBARI have been studying this. They mapped a bunch of really large lava flows at way down the South Rift Zone, and they were able to date them. There's several really huge flows that are about a little more than 1,000 years old. And so they think that that's probably when this current caldera formed, is then that, so much magma was removed from the summit reservoir, but that's when the current caldera formed. Because these other eruptions, we see this inflation deflation signal, but it's only a few meters, right? So it's mostly elastic. It goes up, it goes down. There's some faulting because that's what the earthquakes are showing, but it's not huge. Like it's not 100 meters of slip. It's less than a meter probably. So yeah.
Looks like we have a question online. Go ahead, Roseanne.
What additional measurements would you want to get?
That's a good question. Somebody was asking me before the talk if there was an autonomous vehicle stationed out at Axial, and the answer to that is no, unfortunately. There have been people trying to make that happen for a long time because it's such an active place, and it would be great to have something, the cable's there and there's a bunch of instruments on the seafloor, but there's nothing above the seafloor. So it'd be really cool to have an autonomous vehicle that was stationed out there, connected to the cable. You could tell it to do surveys when something happens. So you could really catch things in the act, especially up in the water column when an eruption happened. So that would be cool.
Any other questions?
Is it practical to put out sensors for gases venting?
Yeah, there's some instruments on the cable that measure the temperatures of the hydrothermal vents and can sample. I think there's one site where they can sample a vent either kind of on a schedule or since it's connected to the cable, they can interactively tell it to sample. So that's like the composition of vent fluids. For gases, it's a little more complicated because to collect the gases in the vent fluids, you need specialized samplers that can hold the the gases inside them, and that's generally only done with an ROV. So Tamara knows all this. You'd have to be out there with an ROV probably to get those kind of samples. Although there might be some autonomous instruments that can do that, but not many. Yeah.
All right, this will be our last question and we'll wrap up.
Really nice talk. Do you have any biologists on the boat? Like what lives out on the seamount and what changes when it erupts?
Yeah. Some cruises we have biologists along and some we don't. It's kind of depends on the year. This last time we didn't, but that has been an interesting part of the story for sure, because at the hydrothermal vents, of course, there are these unique ecosystems that are chemosynthetic. They get all their energy from the chemicals coming out of the vent fluid. And so when there's an eruption, some of those vents get paved over and buried, but then there's new vents that form on the new lava flows and they get colonized. So in 2015, when we were out there 4 months after the eruption, we were already seeing tube worms colonize new vents on the new lava flows. So it happens very quickly. And there have been some really interesting studies of how the vents get recolonized and how that happens. But yeah, there's lots of species of vent organisms that we pass by while we're making our pressure measurements.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I know you said that we wouldn't know when it erupted, but I think we'd hear your team screaming in excitement if we notice it. So how about one more round of applause for our presenter? All right, everybody. Thank you for being here. And once again, Bill, thank you so much for presenting to us. Join us next week if you'd like. Come on back. All right, everyone. Bye now.